Well, welcome to my video. We're going to try to make a strudel recipe. My grandmother always used to make strudel. She was an immigrant from Hungary. She actually grew up on the grounds of the estate of Betliar Castle, which is now in present-day Slovakia. I can remember her making up this strudel, starting with a ball of dough and rolling it out the whole size of a dining room table, and then rolling the whole thing up, making this long coil of Hungarian apple strudel. And it was really something we always looked very much forward to. She'd come out to where we lived in the country outside of Chicago, and she'd always have a Marshall Fields box lined with foil and the strudel cut up inside of it, and it was always very delicious. Haven't made this in a long time. My brother and I tried to make it about maybe 10 years ago together, and we did a pretty good job of it. And I'm going to give it a shot during the holiday baking here at home to see how it turns out solo, and see if my children approve of it as much as I did when I was a kid their age. So I've got a few sources to go on. My sister made a family cookbook sometime in the late 80s, maybe. Maybe it was the early 90s. I think it was the late 80s. And it had a lot of the different recipes in it, including my grandmother's strudel recipe. And it's got one that cites Hungarian cookery recipes, old and new, which is actually a book that was published in 1977. Although it involves sour cream, and I'm going to put some text on the screen here to show the recipe. But sour cream also figures into one of my grandmother's also prominent recipes that she would make, and that's her kolachki, which of course are a very Hungarian thing. And so this recipe is the only one that I found that uses sour cream, and I just feel kind of drawn to the sour cream. I think this is the one my brother and I used a decade ago. That's not to say that there aren't other recipes. I found in the New York Times there was this really great article from 1985, Hungarian strudel made by a master, and of course this is poppy seed strudel in it, and apples and poppy seeds. And I like poppy seeds, but I don't love them, and I know that's heresy for somebody of any Hungarian extraction to say. But I don't. I'm not a huge poppy seed person, although many Christmases I can recall growing up grinding poppy seeds with a poppy seed grinder, which somehow fall to me. So I'm not going to use any poppy seeds. My grandmother didn't use poppy seeds in her strudel, nor will I. This recipe is similar, but it does not use any sour cream. Instead, it uses more water, and it uses some milk in that this other recipe doesn't use, although making it very similar, I think. Lastly, I got this book. My mother has a copy of this, the anniversary of the Slovak American Cookbook. She found a used copy and sent it to me. This has no fewer than 3 strudel dough recipes. The technique for rolling them out is all the same, but these are more along the lines actually of what the New York Times article is. So I'm actually going out on a limb a little tiny bit with my strudel recipe. All right, so I'm getting ready to make my strudel dough, and I'm using, of course, the old family recipe, which says mix a pound of flour with a spoonful of fat. It took me a little while to think about what might be the spoon in question, and I think probably a big old spoon like this, maybe not, but given that a pound of flour is about 3½ cups of flour, I'm going to go ahead and put that in. And my spoonful of fat in this case is going to be a stick of butter, or 4 ounces of butter. I'm going with the great spoon being 4 ounces, and I'm going to go ahead and mix that in like I would a pie crust with my hands. Get that all combined in. And it seems about right ratio. I mean, I'm having to guess at the proportions of this recipe, since they're actually, unless you count a spoonful as a unit of measure, there are none other than a pound of flour. But if you think about the amount of flour you use when you do something like, say, make biscuits or any other kind of quick bread like that, 4 ounces of butter seems perfectly reasonable. It's about the same ratio I used in my scone recipe. So there we are. We have it almost all combined. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to mound it up, as the recipe says, and make a little hole in the center. And I'm going to go ahead and put in my 2 spoonfuls of sour cream, which I'm assuming to be a cup, and I'm going to go ahead and pop that in, like so. There. All right, get that last little bit out. And I am going to go and put in also 2 whole eggs. I had these eggs flown in from Hungary just yesterday. It's not true, they came from the Costco. Put one in. And it said some lukewarm water and a pinch of salt, but I take that to mean maybe a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And I'm going to leave that lukewarm water. It's lukewarm, it's adequately unenthusiastic. I'm going to leave that off to the side in case I feel like this dough is just too dry, which I just don't think it's going to be. It's a fair amount of moisture in here. I'm going to go ahead and get this going. I'm going to do 1 hand mix on this just because I want to keep a hand that's not gloopy with dough. Start to be able to get a ball, which is what we want. My memory serves me correctly. The ball of dough that the recipe should make, roughly the size of a 12-inch softball. Schoolyard days of playing softball or league softball. It's about that size. And we have, would appear, formed a ball in our bowl. I'm a big fan of doing this in this large bowl. Incidentally bought for like, I think, less than $10 at IKEA, maybe actually for $5 at IKEA. It's come together as a bowl. Now this is supposed to be kneaded on the counter for 30 minutes until it becomes elastic and it blisters. And so that is our next step. All right, I've gone and added a little more flour to my yeah, this is feeling good. Just a little tiny bit. Get to pick up that extra moisture. You can already start it feeling getting elastic. And this dough has to get very elastic because it's going to be stretched the size of a dining room table on a white linen tablecloth. All right, so we've got this dough about where we want it. This is just remarkably elastic. Look at this dough. It just really wants to just, whoa. You know, they say do this until it starts to blister. And I think we're starting to get a little bit of blistering. You see there. They being that unknown Hungarian who wrote the recipe. My children are laughing raucously in the background to Sean the sheep, oblivious to the recording in the kitchen. This is a working household here. This isn't some Instagram nonsense. We bake at home. So I think this is about ready to go. I'm hoping this is blistering enough. This sure is possibly the most elastic dough that I've ever made. So the instructions say at this point, roll it into a ball. There's a ball, right? All right, and we're gonna put a little bit of flour under it, not to grease it or anything. And I don't know, using this recipe this way, with my spoonful of fat and my spoonful of sour cream, this dough doesn't need any oil. It's got kind of a little bit of oiliness to it. Feels wonderful, feels like silk. In your hands, and so I'm very much looking forward to trying to stretch it out the size of my dining room table with all the leaves put in it. But before that, there's going to be a little bit of cleanup that has to happen. And we've got to make our apple filling. All right, so my recipe says it's absolutely nothing about the filling, but some of the other recipes say quite a bit. But my basic approach here is I've got these Pink Lady apples. They look really nice. They were on special at the store. I'm going to do 8 of them Normally, I believe my grandmother had one of those apple core spiraler things that definitely sped things up a bit. But I'm going to be going and cutting these babies in half with a paring knife, using my melon baller and core them out. Get the core out, get the stem, and then I'm going to peel them with my paring knife. And then when I've got them all peeled, of course, I am going to go and run them through the mandolin, which, of course, the mandolin being usually the bane of every home cook's kitchen appliance drawer because, of course, they are so very sharp and sort of unwieldy. But, you know, if you use a mandolin properly, and this particular model comes with one of these little things that holds what you're slicing, and I'm going to use, again, this really great big bowl from IKEA. And if you do it that way, you find that you will not chop off your fingers. And of course, this comes with that little bit of, that little thing there so you can go. And there you go. You got some apple slices. And I'm going to be going, and it's going to take me a hot minute to go and peel all these apples and mandolin them. But I'm, of course, going to add some lemon juice. I'm probably going to add some sugar. I'm probably going to sprinkle a little bit of flour on them to give them some thickening so they don't go all over. Some of the recipes say to use breadcrumbs. Some have you grinding walnuts into it, which I'm sure would be wonderful. I'm not going to do that. I don't recall that ever being part of the strudel. Of course, that could be my childhood memories being fallible. All right. All right, so I finished cutting up the apples finally. If you're like me, you love apples peel vinegar. And so these apple peels, if you go and put them in with some sugar and let them set for 2-3 weeks, you end up with a really nice apple peel vinegar. So I'm not going to throw those away. I'm going to go ahead and save those for that purpose. Now I need to run the apples through the mandolin. And of course, I'm going to use my hand guard. Use your hand guard always when you mandolin anything, unless you are really setting out to mandolin your fingertips off. There, we got a big old pile of apples. I'm going to go ahead. I'm a big fan of Steen's cane vinegar. I know my friend Melissa Martin, the chef over at Mosquito Supper Club, is a big fan of Steen's. I'm going to use that instead of my lemon juice. Does the same kind of thing. It's got really delicate flavor, great for salads and stuff like that. I'm going to go ahead and this is, again, very much a fly by the seat of the pants sort of thing here. I'm going to put in some sugar. Right, that would fit right in with my grandmother's recipe, some sugar. Of course, there wasn't even a recipe for this. And I'm going to actually add a little bit of flour on these because that's going to help soak up some of those juices. Not a lot, because I just don't think it's going to need it. I think the strudel itself is going to do that. And lastly, I'm going to add some cinnamon to it. And let's see here, cinnamon, because who doesn't like cinnamon in with their apples? I'll go ahead and sprinkle a little bit in there. I'm not measuring it. That's actually a little more than I intended. But there's a lot of apples here. Go ahead and mix that in. And so if you could smell this, you'd realize this smells really quite wonderful. I think this is going to be delicious on the apple. So now the big hard part comes. I've got to go set the leaves in my dining room table, put on a linen tablecloth, and work at rolling that ball of dough out into an enormous sheet of paper-thin dough into which I can roll up all these apples. Well, we've gotten to the point of this process that has me a little tiny bit nervous, and that's rolling this ball of dough out. I've got my dining room table in here with 2 of the 3 leaves in it and a clean white linen tablecloth on it that we're going to use to spread it out. I normally like using my French-style tapered rolling pin, but since this is my grandmother's recipe, I feel like I almost have to use her old maple rolling pin, which is one of the few cooking utensils of hers that I have. So I'm going to start by putting this ball of dough, get rid of this towel, I don't need it, in the middle, but I'm going to put a little bit of flour on this. I can recall last time my brother and I made this, we did it at my parents' house when they were out of town, and boy did we get a lot of flour all over the place, and maybe we didn't clean it up quite as much as we should have before we left. And when my parents got back from vacation, they found that there was still some evidence of flour around. Sorry, Mom and Dad, about that. If you're watching this, we had a good time and the strudel was delicious. So in the interest of culture, what's a little bit of flour on the floor? So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle this flour out generously on this tablecloth. This is, we'll call this Hungarian parchment paper. And get this sprinkled out. This is kind of, I think, to me, one of the steps that makes this special. Oh, that's a really nice feeling ball of dough. I'm going to leave that flour nearby, handy. The bowl, don't need that anymore. And I'm going to start by rolling it out a little bit. You can only roll it out so far, but I'm going to roll it from the center and try to get started, because what you're going to ultimately do is get your hands underneath the dining room table, rather the tablecloth, and you're going to stretch it with the back of your hands. That's the idea of spreading out a strudel. This is already, of course, rolling out nicely, and oh, it's so delicate, this dough. So the whole point of having the cloth and having all this flour is you want it to scoot along on the tablecloth when you stretch it. So you get your hands under it like so and stretch it. And I know I'm going to make a fool out of myself trying to do this because it's not a simple thing. All right, got back on camera here. We've gotten it stretched out a bit. My wife, who's really good at dough, and has got certainly more delicate hands than I do, suggested that we weren't going to get very far by putting our hands underneath the tablecloth, which is how I remember it. But my memory might not serve me correctly. But what I'm doing is I'm putting my hands underneath the dough itself and stretching it out. You can see it's very thin. You can see my hands through it. And it just stretches out a little bit at a time. Now, I think it pays to be patient with it, because we want to avoid, of course, poking holes in it. And there's some spots where it's translucent, but there are a few things about this dough that are really great. One of them is it doesn't want to stick to itself. So even when it folds over, it doesn't really stick to itself very much, which is good, because otherwise I'd have nothing but a giant ball of dough on this table at this point. And it's incredibly elastic. So we're going to keep stretching it out. It is literally in spots so thin you could read a newspaper headline through it. It is paper thin. And that's what we want. I've got it so thin that I'm almost hesitant to spread it out anymore. I would say that this is easily 40 inches round. I might make it a little bit bigger here, but I'm not going to do much more because I don't want to tear it. And then the next thing, of course, I've got to put my filling on it and then roll it up. This is actually a little bit like a bed sheet, like a 600 thread count bed sheet at this point. Look at how thin that is. You could actually make your bed with this. Make your bed with it and bake it with apples, like a little piggy. Maybe let's not do that. So I'm pretty excited about the way this here all rolled out. So is our dog. Our dog walked by the edge of the table and there's some dough drooped by, and she decided, she is a German breed, a German short-haired pointer, and I think the sort of Central Europeanness of it all was too much for her, and so she took a little bite of the dough, and so my wife came along with a pastry cutter and trimmed it off for me. There's no telling what had happened otherwise. What I'm going to do right now, is brush butter on this, and let me tell you what, this is super thin, and it's just so thin, but yet elastic. And the next big challenge that I've got, of course, is going to be rolling it up without tearing it. And so that's got me a wee bit nervous. All right, now that this is all buttered up, I think we're ready to start fanning our apples out on it. And I know that you don't want to be skimpy. You don't want to mound them up, but you don't want them to be too thin on the ground. So I'm going to leave a little bit of an edge and just start spreading them out on my piece here. Oh, this smells so... All right, well, here we are at Casa Nostrum, and we're about ready to roll this thing up. It ended up taking 14 apples, including 4 Honeycrisp, which were pretty big Honeycrisp, and 10 Pink Ladies. And so rolling it up, we're going to do what we can and hope that this works well. Sometimes I think this is a 2-person job, but it is starting to tear a bit. Unfortunately, I think because these apples have been sitting on it so long while I added more apples, that has me a little concerned. Oh, you know what? I'm going to use the cloth to roll it instead of my fingers. I think that is a good plan. And yes, that is the answer. Virgil, are you going to sing? All right, this is rolling, actually. All right. Now, I probably should have sliced these apple rings in half because they seem to be interfering a little bit with the roll and poking through. Look at how fat that is. I don't think this is going to coil. I think I am actually going to have to cut it. Because I think if this bends, let's see, will this bend? Maybe. Let's see if it has the elasticity now with all these apples in it. I don't know. It's starting to pop apart. You know, I think my apple slices are my enemy here. Yeah, this is like one of those really tricky GRE problems. How do we get the strudel out from under the cloth? Very gently. Oh yeah, this is starting to come apart too. Well, I guess that's one of the lessons of this video. Don't sit around. Cut your apples a little smaller so they're not going to act like bones inside your strudel. And have enough cut when you're ready to roll it, because this is all just turning into a giant mess. Well, in the end, the strudel didn't turn out quite to be the strudel of my memories, although the dough turned out quite well. Of course, my fiasco with the apples kept it from rolling up properly. I talked to my mother about it last night, and she said, oh yeah, your grandmother used apples like Macintoshes, which are soft. Of course, if I'd used these apples, it would have been probably just fine if I'd cut them up smaller and let them sit for a little bit longer, getting soft in the vinegar and sugar. As it was, it rolled up rather frumpily. This one, of course, quite the mess. You know, it looks like it got caught up with in a dark alley by a bunch of thugs and ended up being kind of a rather beat up looking strudel. But I did actually end up to manage to get one decent piece out of the other one, and I had the good fortune to be able to dig into it this morning and try it, and it is quite delicious. Bake time, anywhere from 90 minutes to an hour and 3/4. It takes a long time to bake. Remember, there were 14 apples in this strudel. It was very large, a lot of apples to bake, a lot of layers to bake through at 350. But it ended up with a nice golden sheen on it. I coated it with the sour cream and egg. And once again, sour cream features. You know, it's really, really interesting to me, the role of sour cream in Central European cooking, and how you find it used in so many ways, and this is no exception. So that's it. I'm going to dig into this piece of strudel, and I hope you enjoyed the video, flaws and all.